My opening rant, though, is about how Trump's plan for the military could topple America. The House of Representatives comes back, or is back in session today. The Senate came back yesterday. And between the two of them, there are 24 days between now and the time that government funding runs out on October 1st. That's the beginning of the new fiscal year. Then it's for our government, it's then officially 2025. There's only 24 days that Congress is going to be meeting to pass, funding for government agencies, funding for all kinds of things. The most must pass of all those things, though, is called the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act. And this is so critical because the framers of the Constitution, there were two big issues that were very contentious. If you go back, and it's fascinating reading, by the way, I recommend this. James Madison's journals are online all over the place. You can read them easily. Madison kept the notes of the Constitutional Convention, and every day he kept, he literally wrote down everything everybody said. And there were a lot of debates about a lot of things, but the two biggest debates had to do with either A, slavery, which is not what I'm talking about here, or B, whether we should have a standing army during times of peace. This was a BFD. And most of the members of the Constitutional Convention, because they had seen standing armies during times of peace, when they're sitting in country, they got nothing to do, they're twiddling their thumbs, they rise up and they overthrow the government, right? They've seen military coups. Europe was filled with, the history of Europe is the history of military coups. So how do we prevent this was the big question. And they came up with two strategies. One was that there would be no standing army during time of peace, so the president could basically cut it down to virtually nothing, which, by the way, is what Thomas Jefferson did. When he became president in 1801, there were over 300,000 men in the Army, over 360,000 men in the U.S. Army, left over from the Revolutionary War. By the time he left office in 1809, he had that down to 6,000 men in the Army, which turned out to be a problem because in the War of 1812, we didn't have enough of an army to stop the Canadians and the British from invading and making it all the way down to Washington, D.C. and burning the White House. Remember Dolly Madison rescuing the portrait of George Washington? So that was the end of the conversation about the need to end a standing army. But back when the Constitution was written, it was a hot topic. And so they came up with a couple of strategies. One was the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment was this idea that every state will have a militia. The federal government will officially authorize states to arm their militias. And each state's militia, we call them the National Guard today, each state's militia could be called out in the event that the nation was invaded. This is the way Switzerland, kind of ran their military thing for centuries. It wasn't a novel idea. Countries had been doing this to avoid this very problem of military coups. And to really make it emphatic that they meant business beyond the Second Amendment, they actually wrote into Article 1, Section 8, that the Army of the United States shall not, well, here's the power. This is the actual quote. Congress shall have the power to raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money to that use shall be for a term longer than 2 years. In other words, you can have an army, but every 2 years you have to ask yourself, do we want to continue to have an army? Now, as I said, this has not been a debate since 1812. But it was huge at the founding of the Republic. And therefore, in the Constitution, it says, if you guys don't pass this legislation, the Army ceases to exist, or at least it ceases to be funded. And, within probably a year or so, nobody getting a paycheck, you're not going to have a whole lot of people still hanging around. Not to mention the fact that you can't buy gas for vehicles and you can't buy food for the PX and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why they call the NDAA must-pass legislation. So what does this have to do with Trump? Well, when Trump came into office, being a mobster, being a professional criminal, a professional lifelong criminal, who has been one step ahead of the law his entire life, he believed that the best and most effective way to corrupt our federal government and get away with the crimes that he was intending to commit. He wanted to make a whole pile of money off the presidency. And he did commit a lot of crimes. I mean, the Hatch Act violations, using the White House as a prop for campaign videos, selling products from the White House. It just went, it was a parade of horribles. And that's just among the smallest, right? He figured the way to protect himself from being prosecuted for being a criminal in the White House was to corrupt the Department of Justice. And so he hired Bill Barr. Bill Barr was the guy who helped cover up Iran-Contra for George Herbert Walker Bush and Ronald Reagan. He was George H.W. Bush's attorney general back in 1992 when they pardoned Caspar Weinberger and 4 other people and ended the investigation into Iran-Contra. Lawrence Walsh, the special prosecutor, front page of the New York Times, Christmas Eve, 1992. You know, this is a cover-up. It's a massive cover-up that this crime that Ronald Reagan committed in order to win the 1980 election. You know, cutting a deal with the Iranians to hold the hostages and then selling them weapons as a thank you. So Trump thought Bill Barr was going to protect him, right? We'll take this corrupt guy and put him in charge of the Department of Justice. We'll get another corrupt guy, Chris Wray, or at least a toady, a guy who will go along with what I want. We'll put him in charge of the FBI. And it did. It worked. The FBI and the Department of Justice did not investigate Trump during the 4 years he was president, even though he kept committing crimes. And for 2 full years after he left office, they didn't investigate him because of all the dead enders left over, and Chris Wray is still running the FBI. But now Trump knows that that wasn't enough. He still lost the 2020 election and had to leave office. So he's asking himself, what do I do this time in order to make sure? Well, it turns out that the one thing that stopped Trump on January 6th from declaring a national state of emergency, he actually had an executive order doing this, ordering the military to seize voting machines. And the one thing that stopped him was General Mark Milley, was the military, the Pentagon. The Pentagon said, we will not go along with this. You can call up the military and tell us to go get these voting machines, but it's a violation of the Posse Comitatus Act, and we are not going to do it. So Trump has pretty much said out loud, I mean, just 6 months ago, he called again for firing Mark Milley. He has pretty much said out loud that if he becomes president, the first thing he's going to do is he's going to fire all the heads of the military. He'll fire the head of the Marine Corps, he'll fire the head of the Army, he'll fire the head of the Navy, he'll fire the Joint Chiefs of Staff, all of them, and replace them all with sycophants, with toadies, with Steve Bannon and Kash Patel type people. And I think that, you know, he'll do it. I really do. And I don't think that this is something unique to Trump. I think that any of these MAGA Republicans would probably do the same thing because they're all committed to ending democracy in America and replacing it with strongman fascism. So what do? Well, number one, Congress needs to strengthen the Posse Comitatus Act. Number two, it needs to deal with the emergency powers of the president. Number three, one of the ways that Trump so badly corrupted things, and he did this with his Secretary of Defense, and he did this, Chris, what was Chris's last name? Chris Miller and his assistant, Kash Patel. He did this with, a whole bunch of figures was to make them acting, right? Alexander Hamilton pointed out in Federalist something or other, I forget the number, that the whole point of Senate confirmation was to keep out people of low character, basically, to prevent a president from putting lousy people into office. He says it would, Senate confirmation provides, quote, this is Federalist 76, an excellent check upon the spirit of favoritism in the president and would tend greatly to prevent the appointment of unfit characters. So the Senate needs to change the 1998 Vacancies Act to say that you can no longer do acting people in cabinet positions and positions that require Senate confirmation. You've got to have Senate confirmation. These things would Trump-proof the government. And frankly, I realize the Republicans control the House of Representatives, but there have to be at least 5 or 6 Republicans, or 7 or 8 or 9 Republicans in the House of Representatives who would go along with the Democrats on these things. We got to pull this fascist MAGA weed out. And but in the meantime, we've got to harden our country's defense against it. What say you?